I still remember the way the airport lights shimmered on the polished floor that Christmas day, reflecting families reuniting with laughter and warm embraces. I stood there, clutching a bag of carefully wrapped gifts, waiting for my daughter's car to appear in the endless stream of headlights. Hours slipped by, and the crowd thinned, but I kept telling myself she'll come. She promised. It's strange how you can feel invisible in a place so full of people, how hope can turn to hurt in the quietest ways. If they've ever acted like you weren't there until your absence echoed louder than presence, share your story. And if this feels like your table too, like and subscribe. My name is Eleanor, and I have always believed that Christmas is a season of second chances. Even as the years have quietly gathered on my shoulders, I have never lost that childlike hope that the holidays might bring people closer, that old wounds might soften, and that the warmth of family could outshine the coldest December. This year, as I stepped off the plane at San Francisco International Airport, I carried that hope with me, tucked between the folds of my winter coat and the carefully wrapped gifts in my hands. The terminal was alive with the kind of energy only Christmas can conjure, children darting between suitcases, parents calling out reminders, the distant sound of carols echoing from a nearby speaker. I felt the familiar flutter of anticipation in my chest, the same one I'd felt as a young mother, waiting for my own parents to arrive. Arms full of presents and stories. I had spent weeks preparing for this trip, choosing each gift with care. There was a silk scarf for Julia, my daughter, in the shade of blue that always brought out the warmth in her eyes. For Mark, her husband, a leather-bound journal, because I remembered how he used to scribble notes during our family dinners. For little Lily, my granddaughter, a dollhouse I had assembled myself, each tiny piece reminding me of afternoons spent building forts with Julia in our old living room. I had even baked a tin of ginger cookies, using my mother's recipe, the one that filled the house with the scent of cinnamon and home. As I made my way through the bustling crowd, and I could feel the weight of the years in my bones, but also the lightness that comes from anticipation. I glanced at my phone, reading Julia's last message. Wait for me at the airport. Mom, I'll be there soon to pick you up. There was comfort in those words, a reassurance that I was wanted, that I belonged. I found a spot near the arrivals exit, where the glass doors slid open and closed with a soft sigh, letting in bursts of cold air and the laughter of families reunited. I set my bags down at my feet, arranging them in a neat semicircle, and allowed myself a moment to simply watch. There is something about airports during the holidays that makes time feel both suspended and urgent. I watched as a young boy ran into his grandmother's arms, her face crumpling with joy as she knelt to embrace him. A couple in matching red sweaters shared a quiet kiss, their hands entwined, oblivious to the chaos around them. Each reunion was a small miracle, a reminder of what I had come here for. I thought of Julia as a little girl, her hair in pigtails, her eyes wide with excitement as she waited for her father to come home on Christmas Eve. I remembered the way she used to press her nose against the frosted window, searching for the first sign of headlights in the driveway. The memories came easily, as they always do this time of year. I remembered the first Christmas after my husband passed away, how Julia had insisted on hanging every ornament herself, determined to fill the house with light, even as we both felt the weight of absence. I remembered the year we built a snowman in the backyard, our gloves soaked through, our laughter echoing into the twilight. These memories were my anchor, the thread that connected me to the woman I had been, to the mother I still hoped to be. As the minutes slipped by, I found myself checking my phone more often, watching the battery icon shrink as I scrolled through old photos. There was Julia, age 6. Her cheeks flushed with excitement as she tore open a box of colored pencils. There was Mark, grinning sheepishly as he tried on the sweater I had knitted for him, the sleeves just a bit too long. There was Lily, her tiny hands covered in flour as we baked cookies together last year, her laughter ringing out like a bell. Each image was a small reassurance, a reminder that I was part of something, that I mattered. The crowd around me began to thin as flights arrived and families disappeared into the night. The airport's bright lights cast long shadows on the polished floor, and the air grew colder as the automatic doors continued their steady rhythm. I pulled my coat tighter around me, feeling the chill settle into my bones. Still, I waited, certain that Julia would appear at any moment, her arms open, her smile wide. I imagined the way she would greet me, the warmth in her voice as she called out, "Mom." I imagined the drive home, the car filled with the scent of pine and peppermint, the promise of a family dinner waiting at the end of the journey. I have always been patient, perhaps to a fault. I have learned that love often requires waiting, that the best things in life are rarely rushed. So I waited, watching the doors, watching the faces of strangers as they found their loved ones. I waited as the announcements echoed overhead, as the cleaning crew swept the floor, as the last of the holiday travelers made their way to the parking lot. I waited because I believed in promises, because I believed in Julia. The hours passed quietly, marked only by the slow procession of time and the steady hum of the airport. I watched as the sky outside darkened, the city lights flickering to life in the distance. I thought of the house where Julia lived, the one with the white shutters and the rose bushes out front, the one I had helped her buy when she and Mark first moved to San Francisco. I imagined the tree in the living room, strung with lights and ornaments, the stockings hung by the fireplace, the table set for Christmas dinner. I imagined Lily's laughter, the way she would run to show me her latest drawing, her arms flung around my waist in a hug that always felt too short. I checked my phone again, reading Julia's message one more time, searching for any sign of delay or change. There was nothing new, just the same promise I'll be there soon. I told myself that traffic must be terrible, that the holiday rush had caught her off guard. I told myself that she was probably running late, that she would arrive any minute now. Breathless and apologetic, her cheeks flushed from the cold. I told myself that I was being silly, that I should be grateful for the chance to wait, for the chance to be here at all. As the night deepened, the airport grew quieter, the festive energy fading into a kind of weary calm. The cleaning crew moved through the terminal with practiced efficiency, their brooms whispering across the floor. The announcements grew less frequent, the voices softer, as if the building itself was settling in for the night. I watched as a young woman, her arms full of shopping bags, hurried past me, her eyes fixed on the exit. I wondered who was waiting for her, what kind of welcome she would find on the other side of those doors. I thought of all the Christmases I had spent waiting for my husband to come home from work, for Julia to wake up and race down the stairs, for the first snow to fall. Waiting, I realized, was a kind of love, a way of holding space for someone else, of believing in their return. I wondered if Julia understood that, if she knew how much it meant to me to be here, to be part of her life, even in this small way. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, feeling the ache in my knees, the stiffness in my back. I glanced at the clock above the arrivals board, watching the minutes tick by. I thought of calling Julia, of asking if she was on her way, but I hesitated, not wanting to seem impatient or demanding. I have always tried to be the kind of mother who gives more than she asks, the kind who waits quietly in the background, content to be needed only when the moment is right. The airport was nearly empty now, the last of the travelers making their way to the exit. I gathered my bags, feeling the weight of them in my hands, and moved to a bench near the window. I watched as the snow began to fall outside, soft and silent, covering the city in a blanket of white. I thought of the Christmases of my childhood, the way the world seemed to pause for a moment, the way everything felt possible. I wondered if Julia remembered those days, if she ever thought of me as more than just a presence in the background, waiting to be called upon. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the memories wash over me. I remembered the sound of my mother's voice, the warmth of her embrace, the way she always seemed to know exactly what I needed, even before I did. I wondered if I had been that kind of mother to Julia, if I had given her enough love, enough patience, enough understanding. I wondered if she knew how much I missed her, how much I longed to be part of her life, not just on holidays, but every day. When I opened my eyes, the airport was almost silent. The only sound the distant hum of the heating system and the soft patter of snow against the glass. I checked my phone one last time, the screen glowing in the darkness. Julia's message still there, a promise hanging in the air. I told myself that she would come, that she had not forgotten me, that I was still part of her story. I have always believed in second chances, in the power of forgiveness, in the possibility of new beginnings. As I sat there, surrounded by the remnants of other people's reunions, I held on to that belief. Even as the night grew colder and the world outside faded into silence, I waited, because that is what mothers do. The hours at the airport seemed to stretch endlessly, each minute growing heavier as the night deepened. The festive energy that had once filled the terminal faded into a quiet, almost solemn calm. I watched the world outside the glass darken, the city lights flickering to life in the distance, and felt the cold settle deeper into my bones. The crowd had thinned to a trickle, and the only sounds were the distant hum of the heating system and the soft shuffle of the cleaning crew. I tried to keep my mind occupied, counting the number of times the automatic doors slid open, watching the janitor move methodically from one end of the terminal to the other. I checked my phone again, the screen lighting up my face in the dimness. Still nothing from Julia. Her last message, her promise to come soon, remained pinned at the top, a digital echo of hope that was beginning to feel more like a taunt. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over her name, but I hesitated to call. I didn't want to seem impatient, didn't want to be a burden. I told myself she must be caught in traffic, that something unexpected had come up, that she would walk through those doors at any moment, apologetic and breathless, her arms open for an embrace. But as the hours slipped by, my certainty began to erode. I tried to distract myself by watching the people who still lingered in the terminal. There was an older man in a tweed coat, his hands trembling as he fumbled with a newspaper, glancing up every few minutes as if searching for someone who might never arrive. A young woman sat nearby, her head resting on her suitcase, eyes closed, lips moving in a silent prayer or perhaps a song. I wondered about their stories, about the people they were waiting for, about the promises that had brought them here tonight. The ache in my back grew sharper, and I shifted on the hard plastic bench, trying to find a position that would ease the discomfort. I thought about the years that had passed since I last spent a night in a place like this, the way my body had changed, the way my patience had been both tested and strengthened by time. I remembered the long nights when Julia was a baby, the hours spent rocking her to sleep, the quiet reassurance that she would eventually close her eyes and drift off, safe in my arms. I wondered if she remembered those nights, if she understood the kind of love that endures even when it is not returned. A janitor passed by, his cart rattling softly, and he offered me a sympathetic smile. I returned it, grateful for the small kindness. I considered asking him for directions to a more comfortable waiting area, but I stayed where I was, unwilling to move too far from the exit, unwilling to risk missing Julia's arrival. I watched as he disappeared down the corridor, his footsteps fading into the hush of the nearly empty terminal. My phone buzzed, and my heart leapt, but it was only a notification from the airline, a reminder about baggage claim procedures. I sighed, the sound lost in the vastness of the space around me. I glanced at the clock again, surprised by how late it had become. The world outside the airport was now fully cloaked in darkness, the snow falling more heavily, blanketing the city in silence. I tried to remember the last time I had felt truly at home, the last time I had been surrounded by people who saw me, who valued my presence. I thought of the house I had left behind, the one that now stood empty, except for the memories that clung to its walls. I thought of the years I had spent building a life for Julia, the sacrifices I had made, the dreams I had set aside so that she could have every opportunity. I wondered if she knew, if she had ever paused to consider the cost of her comfort, the price of her happiness. The ache in my chest grew sharper, a dull throb that pulsed in time with the ticking of the clock. I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the present, to remind myself that tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a reunion, a chance to create new memories. But the longer I waited, the more those hopes began to feel like relics from another life, fragile and easily broken. I stood and stretched, feeling the stiffness in my joints, and decided to move to a small cafe near the far end of the terminal. The lights were dim, the tables mostly empty, and the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and cinnamon. I ordered a cup of tea, wrapping my hands around the warm mug, grateful for the heat. I settled into a corner booth, arranging my bags around me like a fortress, and watched the snow swirl outside the window. The cafe was quiet, the only sounds the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clatter of dishes from behind the counter. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth seep into my fingers, and tried to steady my thoughts. I reminded myself that Julia loved me, that she would never leave me here on purpose, that there must be a reasonable explanation for her absence. I replayed our last conversation in my mind, searching for any hint of hesitation, any sign that something was wrong. But all I could remember was her voice, bright and cheerful, promising to see me soon. I watched as a young couple entered the cafe, their cheeks flushed from the cold, their laughter filling the space with a kind of easy intimacy. They sat across from each other, hands entwined, eyes locked in a silent conversation. I felt a pang of longing, not just for Julia, but for the sense of belonging that seemed to come so easily to others. I wondered if I had ever been that young, that certain, that sure of my place in the world. The hours continued to slip by, marked only by the slow cooling of my tea and the gradual dimming of the lights. The staff began to clean up, stacking chairs on tables, wiping down counters, their movements efficient and practiced. I gathered my things, reluctant to leave the small island of warmth, but knowing that I could not stay forever, I made my way back to the main terminal. The silence pressing in around me, the emptiness of the space a stark contrast to the chaos of earlier in the evening. I checked my phone again, the battery now dangerously low, and considered calling Julia one more time. I hesitated, my finger hovering over her name, but in the end, I put the phone away. I told myself that she would come, that she would not let me down, that I just needed to be patient a little while longer. I found a bench near the information desk, the overhead lights casting harsh shadows on the floor. I sat down, feeling the exhaustion settle over me like a heavy blanket. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the distant sound of an announcement, the words blurred and indistinct. I thought of all the times I had waited for Julia at school recitals, at doctor's appointments, at the airport when she returned from college. I thought of the way my heart had always leapt at the sight of her, the way her smile could light up even the darkest room. The terminal was nearly empty now, the only movement the slow sweep of the janitor's broom and the occasional flicker of the security guard's flashlight. I watched as the snow continued to fall outside, the flakes growing larger, the world beyond the glass fading into a blur of white. I felt a sense of unreality, as if I were watching my own life from a distance, unable to change the outcome, unable to reach the people I loved. I thought about calling a taxi, about making my way to Julia's house on my own, but I hesitated. I didn't want to arrive unannounced, didn't want to intrude on whatever chaos might be unfolding in her home. I told myself that it was better to wait, that she would come for me when she was able, that I just needed to hold on a little longer. But as the night wore on, my resolve began to waver. I felt the weight of my own expectations pressing down on me, the realization that perhaps I had asked too much, that perhaps I was no longer needed in the way I once was. I wondered if this was what it meant to grow old, to become invisible, to wait in the shadows while life moved on without you. I stood and stretched again, feeling the stiffness in my legs, and made my way to the restroom to freshen up. The harsh fluorescent lights made me look older than I felt, the lines on my face deeper, the gray in my hair more pronounced. I splashed cold water on my cheeks, trying to shake off the fatigue, and stared at my reflection for a long moment. I wondered if Julia would recognize me, if she would see the woman I had become, or if she would only see the mother she remembered from her childhood. I returned to the bench, my steps slow and deliberate, and sat down once more. I watched as the last of the travelers made their way to the exit, their faces drawn with exhaustion, their arms full of bags and gifts. I wondered where they were going, who was waiting for them, what kind of welcome they would find on the other side of the doors. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. I checked my phone again, the battery now nearly dead, and considered my options. I could wait here all night, hoping that Julia would arrive, or I could take matters into my own hands and find my own way to her house. I weighed the possibilities, the risks and rewards, the fear of being a burden against the desire to be with my family. In the end, it was the memory of Julia's voice, the promise in her message, that made the decision for me. I gathered my bags, feeling the weight of them in my hands, and made my way to the taxi stand outside the terminal. The air was sharp and cold, the snow crunching beneath my feet, the city lights blurred by the falling flakes. I gave the driver Julia's address, my voice steady despite the uncertainty that churned inside me. The ride through the city was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional hiss of the tires on the wet pavement. I watched the world slip by outside the window, the familiar landmarks transformed by the snow, the streets nearly empty at this late hour. I thought about the years I had spent in this city, the memories that clung to its corners, the way it had changed and grown, just as I had. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes kind, and asked if I was visiting family for the holidays. I nodded, offering a small smile, unwilling to share the details of my night. I wondered what he saw when he looked at me, a tired old woman, alone on Christmas Eve, clutching a bag of gifts and memories. I wondered if he had a family waiting for him at home, if he understood the ache of absence, the longing for connection. As we neared Julia's neighborhood, I felt a surge of anxiety, a flutter of nerves that made my hands tremble. I wondered what I would find when I arrived. What kind of welcome awaited me? I tried to steady my breathing, to remind myself that I was wanted, that I belonged, that this was my family, my home. The taxi pulled up in front of Julia's house, the porch light glowing softly in the darkness. I paid the driver, offering a quiet thank you, and stepped out into the cold. The snow was falling more heavily now, the world hushed and still. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, gathering my courage, and looked up at the house that had once felt so familiar. I could see the glow of lights through the windows, the shadows of people moving inside, the faint sound of laughter drifting out into the night. I felt a pang of longing, a sharp ache that settled deep in my chest. I wondered if they were waiting for me, if they had set a place at the table, if they would greet me with open arms. I made my way up the walkway, my steps slow and deliberate, the snow crunching beneath my feet. I paused at the door, my hand hovering over the bell, and took a deep breath. I told myself that I was home, that I was wanted, that this was where I belonged. But as I rang the bell and waited for someone to answer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the world I had known was slipping away, that I was standing on the threshold of a new and unfamiliar life. The door opened, and the warmth of the house spilled out into the night, but I hesitated, uncertain, afraid of what I might find on the other side. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of pine and cinnamon filling the air, and looked around at the faces that greeted me. I searched for Julia, for the daughter I had waited for all night, for the family I had come so far to see. I told myself that everything would be all right, that I was home, that I was loved. But as I stood in the entryway, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and the glow of Christmas lights, I couldn't help but wonder if I had been wrong, if the world I had waited for no longer existed, if I was a stranger in my own life. I held on to my bags, to my memories, to the hope that had carried me through the long night, and waited for someone to call my name. The warmth of the house hit me as soon as I stepped inside, a sharp contrast to the cold that had settled into my bones during those long hours at the airport and the silent taxi ride through the snow. The familiar scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of roasted meat and something sweet, baking in the oven. For a moment, I let myself believe that everything was as it should be, that I was simply late to a family celebration, that my daughter would come rushing down the hallway, arms open, her face alight with joy at my arrival. But as I stood in the entryway, the reality of the scene before me slowly came into focus. The living room was aglow with the soft light of the Christmas tree, its branches heavy with ornaments I recognized from years past, some I had given Julia when she was a child, others that had belonged to my own mother. The fireplace crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the dining table was set with care, each place marked by a folded napkin and a sprig of holly. Laughter drifted from the kitchen, the kind of easy, unguarded laughter that comes when people feel at home. I looked for a sign that they had been waiting for me, a coat draped over a chair, an extra place setting, a gift bag with my name. But there was nothing. The table was set for 6, not 7. The gifts beneath the tree were neatly arranged, but none bore the familiar handwriting of my daughter spelling out Mom. I felt a strange sense of dislocation, as if I had wandered into someone else's celebration by mistake. Julia appeared in the hallway, her expression shifting rapidly from surprise to confusion to something like guilt. She hurried toward me, her hands fluttering nervously as she tried to explain. She spoke of car trouble, of a dead phone battery, of unexpected guests who had arrived early and thrown off her plans. Her words tumbled over each other, each excuse more desperate than the last. But I could see in her eyes that none of it was true. There was no relief in her face, no joy at seeing me, only a kind of strained politeness, as if she were greeting a distant acquaintance rather than her own mother. I tried to smile, to accept her explanations, to believe that this was all just a misunderstanding. I told myself that the holidays were chaotic, that things rarely went according to plan, that I was being too sensitive. But as I looked around the room, I could not ignore the evidence before me. The table was full. The house was full. But there was no place for me. Mark appeared behind her, his face flushed from the warmth of the kitchen and perhaps from the wine. He greeted me with a quick embrace, his words cheerful but his eyes avoiding mine. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of Lily, her hair pulled back with a red ribbon, her cheeks rosy from excitement. She waved shyly, then disappeared into the living room, drawn by the promise of presents and dessert. I set my bags down by the door, suddenly aware of how out of place they looked, brightly wrapped packages meant for a celebration that had already begun without me. I felt the weight of them in my hands, the hours I had spent choosing each gift, the care I had taken to make everything perfect. Now they seemed almost ridiculous, a reminder of how much I had hoped for and how much I had expected. The rest of the family began to gather in the hallway, drawn by the commotion. David and Susan, Mark's parents, greeted me warmly but with a hint of confusion. Their eyes flickered to the clock, to the table, to Julia, as if searching for an explanation. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that they had not been expecting me tonight. Their welcome was genuine, but it was clear that my arrival was a surprise, not the culmination of a carefully planned reunion. The conversation in the hallway was awkward, filled with small talk and forced laughter. I tried to make myself useful, offering to help in the kitchen, to set out dessert, to entertain Lily while the adults finished their wine. But everywhere I turned, I felt like an intruder, a guest who had overstayed her welcome. The house was full of life and warmth, but I was on the outside looking in. As the evening wore on, I became increasingly aware of the subtle ways I had been excluded. The stories they told were filled with references I did not understand. Inside jokes that left me smiling politely while everyone else laughed. The conversation flowed easily around me, but rarely included me. When I tried to share a memory or ask a question, the topic shifted quickly, as if my presence was a gentle inconvenience, something to be managed rather than celebrated. I watched as the family moved through their rituals, lighting the candles, passing the dishes, exchanging gifts. I waited for a moment when someone would turn to me, would draw me in, would make me feel like I belonged. That moment never came. Even Lily, sweet as she was, seemed distracted, her attention pulled in a dozen directions by the excitement of the evening. At one point, I caught Susan's eye across the table. She offered me a sympathetic smile, a small gesture of kindness that I clung to in the midst of my growing discomfort. I wondered if she sensed the tension, if she understood what it felt like to be on the periphery of your own family. I wondered if she had ever felt this way herself, or if she was simply too gracious to let it show. After dinner, as the plates were cleared and the conversation turned to plans for the new year, I excused myself and slipped into the hallway. I needed a moment to collect myself, to breathe, to remind myself that I was not imagining things. I wandered through the house, pausing to look at the photos on the walls, snapshots of birthdays and vacations, of holidays past, of a family that seemed complete without me. I found myself in the kitchen, where the remnants of the meal were being packed away. I offered to help, but Julia waved me off, insisting that I should relax, that I had had a long day. Her voice was gentle, but there was an edge to it, a hint of impatience that stung more than I cared to admit. I watched as she and Mark moved around each other with practiced ease, their movements coordinated, their conversation easy. I felt like a stranger in their home, a visitor who had arrived unannounced and upset the delicate balance of their lives. As I stood there, but I overheard a quiet exchange between David and Susan in the next room. Their voices were low, but I caught enough to understand that they had been told I would be arriving the following day. They were surprised to see me tonight, had not prepared a place for me at the table, had not expected to include me in their plans. I realized, with a cold clarity, that my presence was not just unexpected, it was unwanted. The realization settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. I thought of the hours I had spent at the airport, the hope that had carried me through the long night, the belief that I was coming home to a family that needed me. Now, I saw the truth. I was an afterthought, a complication, a piece that no longer fit into the puzzle of their lives. I returned to the living room, my heart heavy, and watched as the family gathered around the tree to open gifts. I sat quietly on the edge of the sofa, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes fixed on the twinkling lights. I listened to the laughter, the exclamations of delight, the gentle teasing that passed between them. I waited for someone to hand me a present, to call my name, to make me feel included, but the moment never came. Never. As the evening drew to a close, I gathered my things and prepared to leave. I thanked everyone for their hospitality, for the meal, for the company. I tried to keep my voice steady, to hide the hurt that threatened to spill over. I hugged Lily, kissed her soft cheek, and whispered that I loved her. I said goodnight to Mark and his parents, to Julia, who hugged me quickly and turned away before I could see the look in her eyes. I stepped out into the cold night, the snow still falling, the world silent and still. I stood on the porch for a moment, looking back at the house, at the windows glowing with warmth and light. I wondered if they would miss me, if they would notice my absence, if they would remember that I had been there at all. As I walked down the path to the street, I felt the weight of the night settle over me. I realized that I had been waiting for something that would never come, a place at the table, a welcome home, a sense of belonging. I understood, finally, that I was no longer part of their story, that I had become a guest in my own family. The snow crunched beneath my feet as I made my way to the end of the block, the cold biting at my cheeks, the tears freezing on my skin. I told myself that I would be all right, that I would find a way to move forward, that I would learn to let go of the hope that had carried me this far. I promised myself that I would not let this night define me, that I would find a new way to belong, even if it meant starting over. The night air was sharp as I stood outside, but I found myself unable to leave. My feet felt rooted to the porch, the cold biting at my cheeks, the weight of disappointment pressing down on my shoulders. I watched the snow swirl under the porch light, each flake catching the glow for a moment before vanishing into the darkness. I tried to gather myself, to summon the strength to walk away, but something inside me hesitated. I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. I needed a moment to breathe, to steady my heart, to make sense of what had just happened. I turned back toward the house, the windows glowing with warmth, the laughter and voices muffled by the glass. I could see the silhouettes of my family moving inside, their gestures animated, their faces turned toward one another in easy conversation. I wondered if they were already forgetting me, if my absence would even register in the comfort of their togetherness. I felt invisible, a ghost lingering at the edge of a life that had once been mine. I stepped quietly down the side of the house, drawn by the faint sound of voices drifting from the kitchen window. The snow muffled my footsteps, and I moved slowly, careful not to disturb the peace of the night. I didn't intend to eavesdrop, but something in the tone of Julia's voice caught my attention, a sharpness, a frustration that I hadn't heard before. I paused beneath the window, the cold seeping through my coat, and listened. Inside, Julia and Mark were talking in low voices, their words carrying just enough for me to catch the meaning. I heard my name, spoken with a sigh, and I felt my heart tighten. Julia sounded tired, her words edged with irritation. She spoke of the evening, of how difficult it had been to manage everything with me there, of how she wished things could be simpler. Mark's voice was softer, but there was an undercurrent of agreement, a sense that he too felt burdened by my presence. They spoke of the awkwardness at dinner, of the way I seemed out of place, of how hard it was to keep up appearances in front of his parents. Julia confessed that she felt embarrassed, that she worried about what David and Susan thought, that she wished I would understand how much easier things were when I wasn't around. She mentioned the inheritance, almost in passing, as if it were a practical matter to be settled rather than a legacy of love. She said she hoped I would be comfortable, that I would find somewhere else to spend the holidays in the future, that it would be better for everyone. I stood there, frozen, the words settling over me like a fresh layer of snow. I felt exposed, raw, as if every hope I had carried with me had been stripped away in an instant. I wanted to turn away, to pretend I hadn't heard, but I couldn't move. I listened as they spoke of plans for the new year, of vacations and renovations, of things that did not include me. I realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that I was not part of their future. The cold seeped into my bones, but I barely noticed. I thought of all the years I'd spent building a life for Julia, of the sacrifices I had made, of the love I had given without question. I thought of the nights I had stayed up with her when she was sick, the mornings I had packed her lunches, the afternoons I had waited at the school gates. I wondered if any of it mattered now, if any of it had ever mattered. I felt a grief deeper than anger, a sorrow that seemed to hollow me out from the inside. I stepped away from the window, my breath clouding in the air, and made my way back to the porch. I stood for a moment, gathering my thoughts, willing myself to be calm. I knew what I had to do. I would not leave quietly, would not let their words go unchallenged. I would face them, not with anger, but with the truth. I would not let myself be erased. I re-entered the house, the warmth hitting me like a wave, the noise and light almost overwhelming after the silence outside. The family was gathered in the living room, the remnants of the evening scattered across the coffee table, empty glasses, crumpled napkins, a half-eaten plate of cookies. The conversation faltered as I entered, all eyes turning to me. I felt their surprise, their discomfort, but I stood tall, refusing to shrink from their gaze. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice, and spoke. I told them about the hours I had spent at the airport, about the messages and calls that had gone unanswered, about the hope that had carried me through the long night. I spoke of the joy I had felt at the thought of being with them, of the disappointment that had settled in when I realized I was not expected, not wanted. I told them what I had heard outside the kitchen window, the words that had cut deeper than any silence. I did not raise my voice, did not accuse or blame. I simply laid out the facts, the evidence of my absence, like the proof of their indifference. I showed them the call log on my phone, the unanswered messages, the timestamps that marked each hour I had waited. I spoke of the gifts I had brought, the care I had taken, the love I had hoped to share. I told them that I understood now, that I saw the truth, that I would not force myself into a life where I was not welcome. The room was silent when I finished, the weight of my words settling over them like a shroud. Julia looked away, her face pale, her hands twisting in her lap. Mark stared at the floor, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with something like shame. David and Susan exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and sympathy. No one spoke. No one tried to deny what I had said. I felt a strange sense of relief, a lightness that came from finally speaking the truth. I realized that I had been holding my breath for years, waiting for a moment like this, a moment when I could finally let go of the hope that had kept me tethered to a family that no longer needed me. I felt the pain of their rejection, but I also felt a new strength rising in me, a determination to claim my own life and to find my own place in the world. I gathered my things, moving slowly, deliberately, refusing to let them see how much I was shaking inside. I thanked them for the evening, for the meal, for the memories we had once shared. I wished them well, told them I hoped they would find happiness, that they would build the life they wanted. I told Julia that I loved her, that I always would, but that I could not keep waiting for a place that no longer existed. As I stepped out into the night, the cold felt different, bracing, invigorating, almost welcome. I walked down the path, the snow crunching beneath my feet, and looked back at the house one last time. I felt the ache of loss, but also the promise of freedom. I knew that I would grieve for what I had lost, but I also knew that I would survive. I would find a new way to belong, a new way to be whole. The city was quiet as I made my way down the street, the snow falling softly, the world hushed and still. I felt the weight of the night lift from my shoulders, replaced by a sense of possibility. I did not know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. I walked on, my head held high, my heart open to whatever might come next. The city was silent as I walked away from the house, the snow falling in thick, gentle flakes that softened the world and muffled the sound of my footsteps. I felt the ache of loss, but also a strange, growing sense of clarity. Each step I took away from Julia's home felt like a step towards something I had not allowed myself to imagine in years, a life that belonged to me, shaped by my own choices, not by the expectations or needs of others. The cold air stung my cheeks, but I welcomed it, letting it wake me from the numbness that had settled over me during the long hours of waiting. The awkward dinner, the painful revelations. I walked for several blocks, my mind replaying the events of the evening, the words I had overheard, the silence that had followed my confrontation. I thought of Julia's face, pale and drawn, her eyes refusing to meet mine. I thought of Mark, his discomfort obvious, his loyalty divided. I thought of David and Susan, their kindness genuine but powerless to bridge the distance that had grown between me and my daughter. I realized that I had been holding on to a version of family that no longer existed, a vision of belonging that was rooted in the past, not the present. As I reached the corner, I paused beneath a street lamp, the light casting a golden halo on the snow. I took out my phone, my hands trembling slightly, and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for my attorney. It was late, but I knew I would not sleep until I had taken this step. I left a message, my voice steady and clear, instructing her to begin the process of revising my will. I told her that I wanted to remove Julia as the primary beneficiary, that I would be making new arrangements for my estate. I felt a pang of sadness as I spoke the words, but also a sense of resolve. I was not acting out of spite or anger, but out of a need to reclaim my own life, to ensure that my legacy would reflect my values, not my disappointments. I stood there for a moment after hanging up, letting the reality of my decision settle over me. I thought of the years I had spent saving, planning, sacrificing for Julia's future. I thought of the dreams I had deferred, the opportunities I had passed by, the comforts I had denied myself so that she could have more. I realized that I had been waiting for gratitude, for recognition, for some sign that my efforts had mattered, but I understood now that true love does not keep score, does not demand repayment. It gives freely, and it lets go when the time comes. I continued walking, my steps lighter now, the burden of expectation slipping from my shoulders. I thought of David and Susan, their warmth and decency standing in stark contrast to the coldness I had felt from my own daughter. I remembered the way Susan had smiled at me across the table, the way David had offered to refill my glass, the small gestures of kindness that had made the evening bearable. I decided to call them, to thank them for their hospitality, to let them know that I appreciated their efforts to include me, even when it was clear that I was not truly welcome. When Susan answered, her voice was gentle, tinged with concern. I told her that I was all right, that I had found a place to stay for the night, that I needed some time to think. I thanked her for her kindness, for the way she had made me feel seen, even in the midst of my discomfort. I told her that I hoped we could stay in touch, that I valued her friendship, that I wished her and David all the best. She responded with warmth, her words a balm to my wounded heart. I hung up feeling lighter, grateful for the connection, however brief. That had reminded me of the goodness that still existed in the world. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of a hotel in the heart of San Francisco, a place I had always admired but never allowed myself to visit. The ride through the city was quiet, the streets nearly empty, the lights of the buildings reflected in the wet pavement. I watched the city pass by, the familiar landmarks transformed by the snow. The world outside my window both strange and beautiful. I felt a sense of anticipation, a flutter of excitement that I had not felt in years. The hotel lobby was warm and bright, the marble floors gleaming, the air scented with fresh flowers and polished wood. I checked in, my voice steady, my posture straight, refusing to let the events of the evening diminish me. The clerk greeted me with a smile, her professionalism a welcome contrast to the awkwardness I had left behind. I took the elevator to my room, the doors closing softly behind me and sealing me off from the past, off from... The room was spacious and elegant, the bed piled high with pillows, the windows offering a view of the city lights stretching out to the bay. I set my bags down and stood for a moment, taking it all in. I felt a wave of exhaustion, but also a sense of possibility. I was alone, but I was not lonely. For the first time in a long time, I was free to decide what came next. I unpacked my things, placing the gifts I had brought for Julia and her family on the desk. I looked at them for a long moment, remembering the care I had taken in choosing each one, the hope I had felt as I wrapped them, the love that had gone into every detail. I realized that the gifts were not wasted, that the act of giving had been its own reward, that I could let go of the expectation of gratitude or reciprocation. I decided to donate them to a local shelter, to share the joy of the season with those who might need it most. I sat down at the desk and opened my laptop, the screen glowing softly in the dim light. I began to research travel destinations, letting my imagination roam freely for the first time in years. I thought of the places I'd always wanted to visit: the vineyards of France, the art museums of Italy, the markets of Morocco, the beaches of Greece. I made a list, savoring the possibilities, feeling the thrill of anticipation build with each new idea. I called my attorney again, this time to discuss setting up a scholarship fund in my name, a way to support young women who, like me, had dreams that were too often deferred by the needs of others. I felt a sense of purpose, a clarity of vision that had eluded me for so long. I realized that my legacy did not have to be defined by disappointment or regret, that I could choose to leave behind something meaningful, something that reflected the best of who I was. As the night wore on, I allowed myself to dream. I imagined waking up in a new city, tasting new foods, meeting new people, learning new languages. I imagined the freedom of moving through the world on my own terms, unburdened by the expectations of family or society. I imagined finding joy in the simple pleasures of each day, in the beauty of a sunrise, the taste of fresh bread, the sound of music drifting through an open window. I lay down on the bed, the sheets cool and crisp, and closed my eyes. I felt the ache of loss, but also the promise of renewal. I knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that there would be moments of doubt and loneliness, that I would grieve for the family I had lost. But I also knew that I was strong, that I had survived worse, that I was capable of building a new life, one that belonged to me alone. In the morning, I woke to the sound of the city coming to life outside my window. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the sun rise over the bay. I felt a sense of peace, a quiet confidence that I had not known in years. I was no longer waiting for someone else to give my life meaning. I was ready to claim it for myself. I spent the day exploring the city, visiting museums and galleries, walking through parks dusted with snow, savoring the freedom of moving at my own pace. I treated myself to a long lunch at a cafe, lingering over a book, watching the world go by. I allowed myself to feel the sadness, but I did not let it define me. I was determined to find joy, to create new memories, to build a life that was rich and full, even if it looked nothing like the one I had imagined. That evening, I returned to the hotel and began to plan my first trip. I booked a flight to Paris, a city I had always dreamed of visiting but had never allowed myself to see. I reserved a room in a small hotel near the Seine, made a list of museums and cafes to explore, and allowed myself to feel the excitement of a new beginning. As I packed my bags, I thought of Julia, of the life we had shared, of the love that had once bound us together. I wished her well, hoped that she would find happiness, that she would build the life she wanted. I let go of the hope that she would come after me, that she would apologize or ask me to stay. I understood now that my happiness did not depend on her, that I was free to create my own future. I stood by the window, looking out at the city lights, and felt a sense of gratitude for the lessons I had learned, for the strength I had found, for the possibilities that lay ahead. I was ready to set my own table, to savor every moment of the life I had reclaimed. With a deep breath, I turned away from the past and stepped into the future, my heart open, my spirit unburdened, my eyes fixed on the horizon. I was ready for whatever came next. The days that followed felt both unfamiliar and exhilarating, as if I had stepped into a life I had only ever glimpsed from a distance, for the first time in years. I woke each morning without a sense of obligation, without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on my chest. I moved through the city with a lightness I had almost forgotten, savoring the freedom to choose how I spent my hours, to linger over a cup of coffee in a sunlit cafe, to wander through art galleries and bookstores, to sit in a park and watch the world go by without feeling the need to rush home. San Francisco revealed itself to me in new ways. I strolled through neighborhoods I had never visited, letting curiosity guide my steps. I tasted pastries from bakeries tucked into quiet corners, sampled dishes from bustling markets, and allowed myself to be delighted by the simple pleasure of a meal enjoyed alone, with no one to judge my choices or hurry me along. I found myself smiling at strangers, exchanging small kindnesses with people I would never see again, feeling a sense of connection to the city that had always been just a backdrop to someone else's story. Each evening, I returned to my hotel room, the city lights twinkling outside my window, and allowed myself to dream. I made lists of places I wanted to visit Paris in the spring: the lavender fields of Provence, the canals of Venice, the markets of Marrakesh, the beaches of Rio. I researched train routes and museum passes, read travel blogs, and watched documentaries. Letting my imagination roam as far as it pleased, the world felt vast and inviting, full of possibilities I had never dared to consider. I booked my first trip, a flight to Paris, and felt a thrill of anticipation as I received the confirmation email. I imagined myself walking along the Seine, sipping coffee at a sidewalk cafe, losing myself in the halls of the Louvre. I allowed myself to picture a life where each day was an adventure, where I could follow my own desires without apology or explanation. I realized that I was not running away from my past, but moving toward a future that belonged to me alone. There were moments of sadness. Of course, quiet mornings when I missed the sound of Julia's voice, evenings when I longed for the comfort of family, for the sense of belonging that had once defined my life. But I learned to sit with those feelings, to let them pass through me without letting them take root. I reminded myself that grief and joy could coexist, that it was possible to mourn what I had lost while still embracing what I had gained. I found new rhythms, new rituals. I started each day with a walk along the Embarcadero, watching the fog lift from the bay, feeling the cool air on my face. I treated myself to fresh flowers for my hotel room, to books I had always meant to read, to long, leisurely lunches in restaurants where no one knew my name. I allowed myself to rest, to heal, to rediscover the parts of myself that had been buried beneath years of caretaking and compromise. As my departure date approached, and I felt a growing sense of excitement, a readiness to step into the unknown, I packed my bags with care, choosing clothes for comfort and adventure. Tucking my passport and travel journal into a side pocket, I made a list of museums and gardens to visit, of cafes to try, of neighborhoods to explore. I promised myself that I would say yes to new experiences, that I would be open to whatever the world had to offer. On my last night in San Francisco, I stood by the window of my hotel room, looking out at the city spread beneath me, the lights shimmering in the darkness. I felt a sense of peace, a quiet confidence that I had not known in years. I was no longer waiting for someone else to give my life meaning. I was ready to claim it for myself. It was then that my phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a message from Julia. I hesitated before opening it, my heart beating a little faster, unsure of what I would find. The message was brief, a few lines of apology, an admission of regret, a hope that we could talk soon. I read it twice, feeling a mix of emotions, sadness, relief, a lingering ache for what might have been. But I did not reply, not out of anger, but out of a sense of self-preservation, a recognition that I needed time to heal, to build a life that was not defined by longing or disappointment. I set the phone aside, letting the message remain unanswered, at least for now. I turned back to the window, watching the city pulse with life, feeling the promise of the journey ahead. I thought of all the places I would go, the people I would meet, the stories I would collect. I felt gratitude for the lessons I had learned, for the strength I had found, for the freedom I had claimed. I knew that there would be challenges, that there would be moments of doubt and loneliness, but I also knew that I was ready to face them. With a deep breath, I closed my eyes and let the past slip away, opening myself to the possibilities of the future. I was ready to step out into the world, to write the next chapter of my story, to savor every moment of the life I had reclaimed. As the city lights flickered in the distance, I smiled, feeling a sense of hope and anticipation that I had not known in years. I was free, at last, to live for myself, to wander, to wonder, to begin again. As I drifted off to sleep, I knew that whatever lay ahead, I would meet it with an open heart and an unburdened spirit, ready for whatever came next. The first morning I woke up in my hotel room, I was surprised by the quiet. There was no one calling my name, no obligations waiting for me, just the soft hum of the city outside my window. I lay in bed for a while, letting the sunlight warm my face, and realized I could do anything I wanted with my day. That freedom was unfamiliar, but it was also a gift I was finally ready to accept. I started with a walk through the city, letting my feet take me wherever they pleased. I wandered into a small cafe in North Beach, where I ordered a cappuccino and a pastry, savoring the taste and the simple pleasure of being anonymous. I watched people come and go, each with their own story, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was part of the world again, not just a bystander in someone else's life. Over the next days, I explored San Francisco with new eyes. I visited the De Young Museum, losing myself in the colors and textures of paintings I had only ever seen in books. I took a ferry to Angel Island, hiking the trails and breathing in the fresh, salty air. feeling my body grow stronger with each step. I spent an afternoon at the Conservatory of Flowers, sketching orchids and lilies in my journal, letting the beauty of the place fill the quiet spaces inside me. I signed up for a cooking class in the Mission District, learning to make tamales from a woman who reminded me of my own mother, warm, patient, and full of stories. The class was filled with laughter and flour-dusted hands, and by the end of the evening, I had made new friends and promised to join them for a food festival the following weekend. I realized how much I had missed the simple joy of sharing a meal, of being welcomed at a table, even if it wasn't the one I had always imagined. One morning, I took the train down the coast to Monterey, watching the ocean roll past the window, the cliffs and beaches unfolding like a promise. I walked along Cannery Row, visited the aquarium, and sat for hours on a bench overlooking the bay, watching sea otters play in the kelp. I let myself feel small and unburdened, part of something vast and beautiful. I began to keep a journal, writing about the places I visited, the people I met, the moments of quiet happiness that surprised me each day. I wrote about the sadness, too, the ache that sometimes surfaced when I saw a mother and daughter laughing together, or when I passed a family gathered for a picnic in the park. But I also wrote about hope, about the sense of possibility that was slowly taking root inside me. As the weeks passed, I grew more adventurous. I rented a car and drove north to Mendocino, staying in a cozy inn perched on the cliffs above the Pacific. I hiked through redwood forests, the air cool and fragrant, the trees towering above me like silent guardians. I spent an afternoon in a small bookstore, talking with the owner about poetry and travel, and left with a stack of novels to keep me company on quiet nights. I found myself saying yes to invitations I would have once declined. I joined a group for a wine tasting in Sonoma, where I learned to appreciate the subtle differences between varietals and laughed with strangers who quickly became friends. I attended a jazz concert in Golden Gate Park, letting the music wash over me as the sun set behind the trees. I even tried paddleboarding on Lake Merritt, wobbling and laughing as I found my balance, cheered on by a group of women who insisted I join them for lunch afterward. Through it all, I felt myself changing. The Eleanor who had arrived in San Francisco, burdened by disappointment and loss, was slowly giving way to someone lighter, more open, more willing to embrace the unknown. I realized that I was not just surviving, I was living, truly living, for the first time in years. One evening, as I sat on the rooftop terrace of my hotel, watching the city lights flicker on below, my phone buzzed with a message from Julia. Her words were hesitant, full of apology and longing, a hope that we could talk soon. I read the message, feeling a swirl of emotions: sadness, relief, a quiet acceptance. I set the phone aside, choosing not to reply. At least not yet. I needed more time to heal, to build a life that was truly my own before I could consider reopening old wounds. I spent my last night in San Francisco walking along the Embarcadero, the bay glimmering under the moonlight, the city alive with possibility. I thought about the journey ahead, the road trips I wanted to take, the national parks I longed to see, the friends I hoped to visit in other states. I felt a sense of anticipation, a readiness to step into the unknown, to embrace whatever came next. The next morning, I packed my suitcase, tucking my journal and a few favorite books inside, and checked out of the hotel. I had no fixed destination, just a map and a list of places I wanted to explore: Yosemite, Santa Fe, the Oregon coast, the wide open spaces of Montana. I was free to go wherever I pleased, to follow my curiosity, to let each day unfold as it would. As I drove out of the city, the skyline receding in my rearview mirror, I felt a sense of peace and gratitude. I was no longer waiting for someone else to give my life meaning. I was ready to claim it for myself, to write the next chapter of my story on my own terms. I knew there would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and loneliness, but I also knew that I was strong enough to face them. I was living for myself now, savoring each day, each experience, each breath. And as I watched the sun rise over the hills, I smiled, feeling a sense of hope and anticipation that I had not known in years. I was free, at last, to wander, to wonder, to begin again. Whatever lay ahead, I would meet it with an open heart and an unburdened spirit, ready for whatever came next.